Hi, and welcome to the And One podcast. I am your host, Alex West, and I'm joined today by Seldon Levasseur, and we talk a little X's and O's. It's a fun show. There are a few technical difficulties, which I full well admit to, but make sure you're subscribed to the show on YouTube, subscribe to the show on SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcast. You can get it on iTunes. Follow me on Twitter, _Alex_West, and follow the show at And One Analytics to stay up to date. And Brent, take us away. So I'm joined by my guest today, Seldon Levasseur. Seldon, how are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you, man?
I'm doing well. This is your first time on the show. You have been with the 94 Feet Report since the inception, though, right? Like, you're one of the original. You're one of the OGs.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't been around for very long, so it's definitely been a really cool project to be a part of since the beginning and watch it grow. I expected it to, honestly, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's been very fun, and it's been, I mean, we were just talking about, before we started recording, about how much fun it's been to meet new people and talk about the thing that you love to talk about most, which is basketball.
Yeah, and just running in, like we said, like running into random people on Twitter is really awesome, just realizing that they're a part of it and being able to interact with them through that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So give us the intro, introduce yourself to us, let us know who you are, what you do.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I write for the 94 Feet Report. I also coach high school basketball. I'm a varsity basketball coach, which is a pretty interesting place to be coaching basketball. But yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I can imagine that varsity coaching job. You get a lot of guys who want to jack 30-footers because they saw Steph Curry do it.
Oh, yeah. No, it's actually been really cool watching people's shots develop better because they watch everybody shoot at the NBA level.
Well, that's awesome. See, I would have expected it to go the other way, just bad shot selection. Like, I saw Steph Curry do it, so I can do it.
Oh, shot selection isn't good. Don't get me wrong. The fundamentals of shooting are a lot better since watching guys like Steph Curry or Klay Thompson shoot. I get a lot more freshmen or sophomores coming into the program who actually have solid mechanics already.
Yeah, that's awesome. Like, when I was playing high school basketball, we had, like, two guys that could shoot just because it was still in that, like, late 90s, early 2000s ground and pound. It was all about post moves and footwork and stuff. So
or dribbling. Everybody, when I was playing,
yeah, that's it. All right, so let's jump into the NBA and talk about that for a little while. It's been a crazy offseason. I mean, that's what everybody's saying. Everybody's talking about everything that's happened. I'm still not sure whether it all matters, but what's been the most interesting offseason story to you?
Well, nothing really specific, but I do think that the overall value for superstars in the league right now has been really fascinating as far as trades go. And like comparing, like you look at what like Kyrie versus like the Paul George or Jimmy Butler trades, I think that's been like really interesting to watch the value be sort of like quantified in a very specific way across the league.
Yeah, it is interesting that, particularly because it's sort of on a scale. Like Jimmy Butler, who had 2 years left in his contract, fetched Zach LaVine, a pick swap, and Chris Dunn, who may or may not be an NBA player. But then Kyrie, with 2 years left on his deal, landed a much more favorable set of picks for Cleveland with the Brooklyn pick, Isaiah Thomas, and Jay Crowder. So it really has been an interesting comparative market because some guys that you thought they would have more leverage with their organization, some guys you thought they would have less, and it turned out that the market is sort of skewed and we don't really know what anybody's worth.
Oh, yeah, no, and I think that it's been running sort of counter to what I think people are. Like, I would look at Jimmy Butler versus Kyrie Irving, and I would take Jimmy Butler on my team over Kyrie just about every time just because he plays so much better defense on the other end of the court. So it's been really interesting watching sort of how the values are skewing more towards offense in general. Yeah, that's been a really interesting trend to watch this offseason.
And then apparently Paul George is only worth Victor Oladipo and Domantas Sabonis. So that was interesting because he to me was the best of the 3 or 4 guys that were seemingly available. Paul George is a great two-way player. I like him a little bit better than Butler. I know that you can argue either way, but to me, he was the most valuable player, and seemingly he fetched the worst price of all of them. Now, negotiation, 1 year left in his deal, ready to go to LA, has a lot to do with it, but like you said, it's been very interesting to watch that unfold and begin to understand. Well, I say understand like you could understand the market, but understand the market with finger quotes around it.
Oh no, I totally agree. And I as well. I think he sort of entered the Indiana negotiation position because he was already talking about going to LA, and when his contract is up. So I think that really tanked his value, and you sort of see, you see a very specific example of what happens with talking to the media from these players, which I think is also a really interesting thing to look at.
Yeah, just the way they use the media now, which is something that in older generations hasn't been something that they've done. Players have shied away from the media, but in the social media era, it seems that players have a better relationship and a better understanding of how to utilize the media to their advantage.
Oh yeah, no, I completely agree. And you see some guys really manipulating it, like LeBron James does. He plays them like puppets.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's what LeBron. I mean, at the end of all this Kyrie stuff, that was the question that I had was how much of this was manipulated by LeBron, because there's a school of thought that says like if LeBron can manipulate it to where he knew that Kyrie wanted out, so he put that out there, so they had to trade him, so the team was worse, so they weren't competitive, and you start to look and see down the line where it can be a situation that LeBron can leave Cleveland and still not be the bad guy like he was after the decision in 2010. If everything starts to fall into place, which it seems like it has, perhaps if Isaiah Thomas doesn't play all year, but it would have been much harder to walk away from a title contending Cleveland Cavaliers team than possibly a team that maybe doesn't reach the finals. And so I think that's been a very well thought out thing by LeBron. And we won't ever know that, but that's just sort of my hypothesis about what's happened.
Well, I think you see a lot of times too. I did an article on this actually a few weeks ago, and you see a lot of people coming out into the media after the fact and talking about whether it's a minority owner with the Heat, talking about how LeBron James handled the media and how he wanted to get out of Miami. I think we could definitely see sort of a tell-all type situation, or at least like learn more of the story of leaving Cleveland, which I don't think that's as guaranteed as a lot of people think. I think that, Jay Crowder and Isaiah Thomas could wind up, they could be competitive. And if he thinks he can win there, like, I don't know why he would leave necessarily. It is home. But yeah, I think that like we are going to learn a lot more about what has gone on sort of behind the scenes as the years unfold.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like probably in the post-LeBron era, there'll be that book that starts to pick things apart, similar to the Jordan Rules or Breaks of the Game, like all these books that were written after the fact where you started to understand the dynamics that were at play in the locker room. Which teams do you feel like have done the most to improve themselves during this offseason?
So I think that Minnesota or Oklahoma City probably will see the biggest jump in their like wins or seeding. But Boston and Houston made the better moves for postseason success. So I think it's a little bit of a more complicated answer. I think like if you're looking at just overall record or where they stack up in their conference, you're going to see the biggest jumps and the biggest improvement in Oklahoma City. But I think those other two teams are going to go a lot deeper and be a lot more competitive in the playoffs against like the truly elite teams.
Yeah, it is interesting. I have said a couple of times on the podcast and just talking with people, I don't think Minnesota's quite a finished product yet. I think their floor spacing is kind of awful because Karl Anthony Towns is probably their best three-point shooter, which is not great. Wiggins is obviously up and down. He does well for periods and then does terribly for periods. But I still feel like maybe there's a Jeff Teague trade or something if things don't quite work out with him, because he wasn't the kind of guard that they needed. They needed more of a George Hill kind who could play a little off ball and let Jimmy Butler handle the ball a little more and be able to knock down a three-pointer. So I don't think that was quite a great fit, and they feel kind of 90s basketball to me. So I'll be interested to see, particularly in the first 20 games of the season, like that first quarter of the season, how they adapt and how they decide to play basketball. Because if they can adapt it to where they're winning a lot of 92 to 89 games, then maybe they have a formula that works. But the NBA has certainly shifted away from 92 to 89 games.
Well, and I completely agree. I think they have one spot missing in their starting lineup. It sort of depends where you want to play Andrew Wiggins and Jimmy Butler. like what their positions would be. So I do think they're one person short. I do like Jeff Teague. I think that you could see him pushing the pace. They're all very athletic. But defensively, I think that the biggest jump, and like in all honesty, and I know everybody looks at him as being sort of the darling of the NBA right now, but I think Karl Anthony Towns has to make the biggest jump for this team to be truly elite defensively. He's great when his guy actually has the ball, but when it's off ball and he has to play help side and come help onto a penetrating or, a driving offensive play, makes a lot of mistakes in that aspect of the game. And I think that if he makes that jump, this team really could be a defensive squad. And we could see those games that you're talking about, the 95-92 wins, the
Do you think that Towns is going to play more of a 4 or more of a 5? I mean, there's certainly an argument for both, that he needs a little protection behind him from a guy like Gorgie Ding, or maybe that he can play a 5 in a more athletic lineup. I mean, I just don't know if he's quite decided, or if Minnesota's quite decided what position he's going to play when it comes down to crunch time. Yeah,
I mean, that's a really good question. I think that for the team that they're building, I would like to see him play the 5, just because it's going to be really tough if he's their center and he's the slowest player out on the court with them. It's going to be really tough for a lot of teams to be able to keep up with that team. Andrew Wiggins is a very fast player. Like Jeff Teague pushes the pace, and then if Karl Anthony Towns is your center and he's running past all these other centers in the league, it's going to be really tough to keep up with them in transition, and they'll probably get a lot of easy. So I think that based off of their current structure, I'd like to see him play the 5. It depends what else they get. As we've both said, like, they're missing that one last piece in their starting lineup to really be an elite team. So it depends what that piece is.
Yeah, that'll be the big test for them in the early season, is sort of shaping that out and maybe looking for that one more trade. I mean, I thought that maybe they were going to make a play for Kyrie, and obviously they didn't, which probably wouldn't have addressed a lot of their concerns, but it would have given them some more firepower offensively. So I will be interested to see what path they elect to go and where Towns ends up playing, if he plays more of the 4 or the 5. But I think it leads naturally to my next question. All this movement, you talked about Boston, Houston, these teams that are going to make late postseason runs. Does any of this matter? I mean, the Warriors are coming off a championship season. They're 2 seasons away from going 73-9. They seem dominant. They've added Kevin Durant. Obviously, all these things have happened to cement them at the top of the league. Is there any chance that they're going to get dethroned?
I mean, in short, the answer is no. There's very few examples, or I can't really think of any, where you see on a team at any one time. A lot of people compare them to the Bulls teams with Jordan, but I think that this team as a whole just has more talent on their roster. And I think Boston will probably come the closest. You look at their matchups on defense. That would probably be the final series I would like to see. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, they're still going to be the underdog, and that's sort of like the way that this league has gone. The Warriors have been on the top for a while now, and I don't think that anybody can really make a move short of deciding to go play in Boston as well, where we would really see a team really have the same level of talent to compete. Of course, like everybody talks about the twisted ankle in the playoffs or whatever that derails all of this, but assuming everybody's healthy, I think you're going to see Golden State just continue to have their run of dominance.
Well, Las Vegas tends to agree with you. I saw the booking this morning for Las Vegas odds, and the top 3 odds were Warriors Celtics, Warriors Cavs, and Warriors Raptors were the top 3 favorites for the NBA Final Series before the season started. So it looks like the Eastern Conference is a little more open. The Western Conference, Las Vegas tends to think that the door is pretty shut. Which is interesting because normally you don't see those odds. If there's any sort of chance that a team is going to sneak in, they usually get decent odds, so Las Vegas doesn't lose a ton of money. But they seem to be all in on this Warriors team.
That's really interesting. I'm a lot higher on the Wizards than I think it sounds like a lot of those other guys are. Like, I would probably choose the Wizards would get in the finals over Toronto right now.
Yeah, I saw a lot of people loving Toronto. I mean, obviously their core's still intact, but I'm not sure how good their core is. Maybe with a year playing together, that means something. But to me, I'm with you. Like I like Washington a lot more than I like Toronto. And NBA Math did or Nylon Calculus. Nylon Calculus released their plus minus today, and they had Toronto finishing second in the Eastern Conference behind Cleveland, which I thought was strange.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that the regular season record is going to be a lot different than what we see in the playoffs, which is like an important distinction to make. Like Toronto could very well finish second. But when it comes time for the actual playoffs to get here, I mean, we saw DeMar DeRozan basically fall apart in the playoffs last year. His game in particular is something that might hold him back from like really being able to compete with some of these other teams that are like at the top of the Eastern Conference. You know, if I had to choose between Bradley Beal and DeMar DeRozan, I'd probably take Bradley Beal. And, you know, obviously John Wall and Kyle, like they match up well, but I think that the Wizards, just based off of like athleticism and speed, are a lot, you know, I would take them in a matchup.
Yeah,
series.
The Wizards pushed the pace against the Celtics last year, looked tremendous playing that up-tempo offense, but their half-court game needs a little work, so Toronto, in a hypothetical series that's 9 months from now, Toronto would need to slow the game down in order to compete with that, because John Wall is, I think, unequivocally the fastest player three-point line to three-point line in the league. He pushes the pace, and he runs, and he dribbles, and he does everything so tremendously in transition that he is a very difficult matchup for a team like Toronto that's kind of slow-footed and likes to play in half-court.
Well, and honestly, like one of the teams that get left out of this a lot, just because, you know, the whole thing with John Wall sort of made me think of it. The Bucks with Giannis, if he makes that last jump that I think everybody is expecting him to really make, you know, I think he'll improve incrementally from here, but he could make one last real jump in skill. And I mean, he's a guy that could take over for all of the current superstars and being like one of the best or the best player in the league. And, you know, they're putting a pretty interesting team down there together. And I, you know, again, assuming Giannis makes that jump, I think you could see them cause a lot of issues for a lot of teams in the playoffs.
I think a lot of the Bucks' success is contingent on Jabari Parker being healthy. I mean, Parker's on his, third knee surgery in the past couple of years, and they need him to be what he looked like he could be before he got hurt last year, which I know is quite a qualifier, but that's what they need from Jabari Parker, is a guy who can put up 20 points, who can play a little bit of all the 2, 3, and the 4 when he needs to, is flexible, and it is a guy who can get buckets when they need. And I think that Giannis is going to develop. He's going to be a great player, but their success is sort of reliant on those other pieces developing with him, which is a little bit more worrisome to me than Giannis's development, because I feel like that's going to happen at a level that's respectable. But if guys like Malcolm Brogdon and Middleton and Parker don't keep developing, then they could be not quite as good as what people tend to think they will be.
Yeah, and I think that Middleton is, I mean, I sort of would put Middleton in sort of where you're putting Parker, I think. He hasn't had a lot of court time shared with Giannis, and I think that one of the really interesting season to watch is going to be watching how those two guys sort of play off of each other, because sort of they sort of have overlapping skills on the court as far as like where they get their shots from and all those other things. Obviously, Giannis has a lot more versatile game and does a lot more, my opinion. But Middleton is sort of that contrasting force where he is a really good spot-up shooter. He's that great wing perimeter defender that they really desperately need there. And watching how he meshes with Giannis and Brogdon, as you mentioned, who's also a really good shooter and defender, like watching how he meshes with that team in a full season is going to be the key for them to have success, not only in the regular season, but in the
yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, that's going to be the growth of that team, like regardless of who you tab as the second most important guy, the growth of that team is their success is pivotal to that growth, and you have to think that it's going to be difficult with such a young team, but probably they'll be able to pick up some wins because the Eastern Conference is so bad, which might be enough to get the wheels rolling to let those guys develop. My question I've been asking everybody, and I can't wait to hear your answer to this, is who are your 3 teams that are on your League Pass queue every single night?
So I'm a Houston Rockets fan, so I'm going to take them out of it because it's from my queue. But I think Milwaukee and Denver are probably the 1A and 1B. If they're on, like, I'm pretty much going to be tuning in. And then OKC is sort of in that next level down. But if they're on and the other two teams aren't on, I'm going to absolutely be watching OKC play.
All right, why Denver? Denver's a team we haven't touched on.
Denver is, so I really like the team building aspect to the NBA in particular, and they're building a really fascinating roster. I love the guards and the athleticism. I love watching, I mean, everybody likes watching Jokic play. The passing skill, athletic shooters around them. Jamal Murray is also a guy I love. I mean, up and down their roster are guys that I just absolutely love watching play on league. That's an exciting team. They're one of the best offenses in the league. Their defense is terrible. Hopefully Millsap helps with that. But offensively, they're a very, very good team. And I just, if I'm going to tune into a team on League Pass and just sort of enjoy a night of basketball, that's sort of what I'm going to be looking for.
Okay. And before we get into what you wanted to talk about today, let me ask you one more question. What's your hot take that NBA Twitter, other writers, Reddit, whatever, that we'll disagree with?
This is a good question. I think that the Clippers are going to be in the San Antonio Spurs this season.
You think the Clippers are going to be better than the San Antonio Spurs?
I do.
Okay, what's your numbers for this? What are your win total numbers? Are you not ready to say yet?
I'm not ready to go with win totals. I think that San Antonio is going to be in a tougher division, playing with, I think Dallas has really improved. Houston, I'm higher on the Pelicans than a lot of people are, I think. That division has been one of the most competitive divisions in basketball for the last 5 years. That's going to take a pretty heavy toll on their record. I also don't like, again, talking about team building, I don't like the way that they put their roster together recently. You look at Kawhi as obviously one of, if not the best players in the league. But around him, there just isn't much. You got Dejounte Murray, who's coming in, LaMarcus Aldridge, who, again, sort of is getting played off the court at this point. And the Clippers are really, really going to have a really amazing defensive team. I also think that if you look at the numbers sort of on-off with Blake Griffin without Chris Paul on the court, the team ran really well through him. And I think that that's going to be something that's going to be really interesting to watch is now that he is sort of the lead offensive, it's going to be really interesting to see sort of where their ceiling is. And personally, I think that with the defense around him, it's going to be a really good season for them.
Point forward Blake is something that's always been interesting to me. Because he's a great passer for a forward. He's got good vision. He can run an offense. So I think it'll be pretty cool to see that shape up. There's a couple of things about the Clippers that I don't love, and that one of them is that first of all, people seem to think that Doc Rivers is a ball movement coach, and I've watched Doc Rivers for the past 10 years, give or take, between his Orlando tenure, his tenure with the Celtics, and now with the Clippers. And that's one thing he's not to me, as a ball movement coach. He sort of gets stuck in this log jam, let one guy beat the leather off the ball, be it Paul Pierce, be it Chris Paul, whoever, let one guy beat the leather off the ball and hope that you can get something out of it. But particularly late in games. And people seem to be sort of high on that frenetic ball movement pace, but that's not Doc Rivers' strong suit. So I'll be interested to see if he can play to his team's strength, which certainly is going to be a little bit more up-tempo than it has been in the past few years. But I will be interested to see if they finish up better than San Antonio, a team that a lot of people are predicting in the mid-50s as opposed to the mid-40s for LA.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that the overall age on the San Antonio roster is really going to – I mean, people have been saying that for years, so really come back to sort of bite me in the butt. But I just think that the overall age in San Antonio, they're going to have to be playing sort of this weird contrasting style, playing slowed down. I think Kawhi is a really athletic guy, and he's going to want to push the pace more along with Murray. And it's just there's going to be a lot of weird things going on down there. Obviously, Popovich sort of gives them that edge that makes me really nervous. If he wasn't there, I think a lot of people would be lower on San Antonio than But yeah, I'm really intrigued by especially the defensive combination of Patrick Beverley and DeAndre Jordan. You have like a really intense defensive ball stopper on the perimeter, as well as the best defensive centers in the game today. So that's a really interesting combination to me, and I think a lot of teams again they're going to struggle with that.
Yeah, I'll be following that pretty closely. Now, you posted this on Twitter. We talked about it briefly a couple of days ago. You're talking about the power center, and that's what we wanted to really get into today. Now that we've gone through the changes in the league, you wanted to talk about and I'm using air quotes here that you can't see, but the power center. So go ahead and describe for everybody listening what you mean when you say that.
So there's really like the main guy that I think of when I say that is Shaq. I'm thinking like the 7-foot tall guy that gets the ball in the low block and is like a more physically dominant player than we really have in the league today. He like the kind of guy that will go through you for a dunk instead of the fadeaway jumper. Somebody who like really possesses good footwork and moves in the low block. And there are a lot of reasons which we can go like talk about throughout this conversation why that doesn't really. But I think that that's sort of the archetype of the player that I'm talking about is, again, like you can feed him down on the block. He requires at least, 2 people to come down and try to stop him. And he's physically bigger than everybody else on the court.
So you say the power center, you're talking about this physical guy. That's pretty much a dead position in the league. Like you said, there aren't a lot of guys who do that. And Shaq was the last really successful one. There have been others who have certainly done that, done like a Shaq-like impression. But Shaq was the last really successful team builder. Is this a skill set that you can find success in today's NBA with?
Yeah, so this is like the really like part of this whole conversation is that the game is going so far away from this, like feeding the ball on the block. Even George Karl has a quote where he says that you can't do this anymore. And you see guys like Draymond Green or KD posting up on the block. But if you were to like think about, again, like, so you're thinking about this Golden State team and you think about their roster and really their only true quote unquote center is JaVale McGee. If you were to find a guy like, again, I think that even like Dwight Howard back in like 2009 is sort of a more recent example of that. And there's not really a lot of teams are going so that there isn't a guy that can actually stop them from scoring 70% of the time that they touch the ball, which is like absolutely crazy to think about. But DeAndre, 70% of the time that he gets the ball on the block. He's really tough to stop. And DeAndre Jordan, in all honesty, doesn't have a very good offensive game. I mean, a lot of people who watch him obviously know this. Like, he's pretty if he had any offensive polish, I think that, there wouldn't be guys who could stop him. So it isn't so much that, like, the game, that the skill set isn't there. It's that rosters are going so far away from this that on the team that can stop it, which is why I'm so intrigued by like getting that, like somebody in that mold back in the league. Because I mean, again, like think about the top teams in the league today. The Cavs and the Warriors were in the finals last year. Who would guard Shaq if 2001 Lakers played against from last finals? Tristan Thompson guards Shaq. Shaq eats him alive.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely no Shaquille O'Neal-like players in the league, and there's nobody to guard him. But I don't know. I mean, I guess my argument, it starts to go back to that, like, oversimplification of mathematics. But you only have to shoot 33% from 3 to average 1 point per possession, but you have to shoot 50% from 2. And it just, as those percentages grow, that point differential starts to grow. And we learned... Probably as a basketball culture, we learned about this in the 2004 Olympics with our Tim Duncan, Allen Iverson debacle of a team. But what we did learn from the international perspective was international teams were starting to focus on a space and pace offense, wherein the NBA was a little bit behind. And now, it's caught up. Obviously, we're 13 years away from Athens, but that pace and space, that 3-point shooting, ball movement, whipping the ball around, kind of offense has taken the league by storm. And to me, that kind of leaves the power center out to dry. That slowing the game down and feeding the guy in the post and letting him ground and pound doesn't really work in a way that it used to work, because that used to just be the thing. But now with the improvement of three-point shooting in particular, it's much harder to just look at it from a purely mathematical point of view and go like, okay, this is a way that we can be successful. I think what I'm trying to say is that...
Well, actually, I'd like to kick back on that a little bit, if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So if you look at like the best, Steph Curry is the example of the quote unquote in history or in the league today, however you want to view it, right? So he's shot 41% last year, or 45% 2 years ago. If you have, again, and I'm looking at the DeAndre Jordan example, and I want to re-emphasize that he is not the guy that I'm thinking position, because he doesn't have a very polished offensive game. He shot 70% on his post touches last season. So he actually scored possession on his post touches than Steph Curry did shooting threes. So, to everybody wants to sort of spread the floor out around these shooters is going so small, it makes it easier for that really, really big guy to score inside. His percentages are going to go up to the point where you would have to shoot 55% from three in order to match that, which is something that not very many players are going to be able to do, especially as we put a higher premium on guys who can defend all over the court, those guys who can defend on the perimeter.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's numbers, they obviously can't tell the whole story. And if you started to bear that 71% out into more usage rate, I totally get what you're saying. But in terms of efficacy and effectiveness, the game has become so razor thin when it comes to margins of for example, if you look at Houston's roster construction from last year, basically they constructed a roster that was built around if we shoot 45% from three, we can beat the Warriors. And that's how they built their team. And, they didn't get there. They lost to San Antonio or whatever. But that's the way they built their roster, was we're playing a mathematical game that says 4 times in 7 games we can shoot 40+%, and then we can beat the Warriors if we get that kind of shooting. And so, yeah, it just seems to me that you're going to have more attempts, you're going to have more wear and tear on a body. You're going to a lot more can go wrong in a situation where you're putting it on the inside instead of spreading the ball around to 4 or 5 guys around the perimeter. Which is not to say, you're totally right about saying that it would create more space. And then if you had a guy like this, perfect example being what you said earlier with the 2009 Magic, where they did just put 4 shooters around Dwight Howard and let him sort of patrol the paint, and that worked out. But I don't know. There's really no follow-up to this except to say that basketball has become so mathematically friendly with the three-pointer that it's hard to see a shift away from it without an overwhelming talent like Shaquille O'Neal.
Well, so you used the Houston Rockets as an example for this, which is, I think, really fascinating. Again, I probably watched 70 of the Rockets games last year. And I can tell you that the big thing that killed them, which obviously, but the problem with the 3-point shot, in my opinion, is that you see there's more up and downs.
Right. That's so, yeah.
Throughout the game. And so sort of the issue with this idea of the mathematical approach, and Daryl Morey has actually talked about this, is that they are trusting the law of averages to bear out. That over average, they have more 40% 3-point shooters on their team. Eventually, they will shoot 40% as a team, in a 7-game series. The problem is that basketball in a 7-game series doesn't have law of averages, really. If the Rockets go cold for 4 games, that's the end of the season. Whereas, if you have that big guy inside, and as you mentioned, talking about putting guys around him that can shoot. If you have that big, much more reliable, especially as we're talking about other teams not having him, he's going to be much more consistent game in and game out to be able to go get those 25 points.
Yeah, playing closer to the law of averages.
Yeah, exactly. And I still think you need to trust three-point shooting. You can't go back to triangle offense or whatever you want to talk about as sort of the example of the really slow, I'm just going to just watch him dribble for 16 seconds and then put up a hook that either makes or misses. I think that, again, the Magic, and I want to reemphasize, even Dwight isn't the most polished offensive player on the post. So if we're talking about, again, that Magic team, if you gave 25% more offensive polish, how much more dangerous would that team be? So I think that putting shooters around him is still a big part of this, because if you have a really big guy who can score inside and you feed him the block and it requires two people to stop him, a double team, part of the reason why that power center also doesn't exist in the NBA today is because teams can play zone. But if you can get the ball into him, he can kick it to a shooter on the perimeter that can make that shot, sort of more of a spot-up shooter. And you can still see that mathematical success bear out. I don't think that you need to have the Joel Embiid, the Brook Lopez, the Karl Anthony Towns style. Obviously, if you have that guy, it's a benefit. But one of the things that I really the reason why I wanted to talk about this today is because we have gone so far away from that it's almost like poison to have that really dominant low post guy on be a central part of your offense when they don't factor in the kick out, the inside outside pass, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think so one of the issues with having a big guy sort of played out in NC State last year, and they played with two bigs with Dennis Smith. And Dennis Smith didn't have a lot of room to work in the paint. And I think with the rise of guys like Isaiah Thomas, and setting aside for a moment, I don't think Isaiah Thomas could have been very successful as a player outside of this era right now. Particularly if he'd have played in the 80s or the 90s, just his size and the amount of punishment he would have taken its toll on him. But setting that aside for a moment, you see guys like James Harden, guys like Isaiah Thomas, guys like Kyrie Irving, who have made the most, who have maximized their offensive games because of the space on the floor. The fact that there is one guy in the paint, maybe no guys in the paint when it comes to the offensive set. And I think that maximizing that perimeter play and being able to penetrate and then slash and kick is sort of what you're talking about in reverse. Because it's much easier for a guy, to me, it's much easier for a guy like James Harden or Isaiah Thomas to make that kick-out pass than it is for a back-to-the-basket guy like Shaquille O'Neal, like Andre Drummond, or whoever you want to say, even Dwight Howard. What you've done is you've effectively, when you rely on a guard to penetrate, you've effectively put him in the center position, that now he's in the teeth of the defense, but he's a much better passer. He's a much worse finisher, by and large, but I guess my counter argument to say is well, that still exists. It's not the traditional back to the basket kind of center big guy, but putting a player within 2 to 5 feet of the rim is still a huge part of the game. It's just taking a different role when it comes to X's and O's.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I think that though, which you sort of hit on, right on the nose, is that those guys aren't going to finish as well as your traditional center inside. So while James Harden does a lot of defenders, you still see teams not necessarily. So I don't know whether you were able to, again, watch Shaq play or Dwight play in their prime, but when they got the ball on the block, the entire defense was glued to him, and it was almost like this. A lot of people talk about the gravity that Steph Curry plays with today, where he sort of floats around the perimeter and the defense sort of has to stay with him, and it stretches them out in a very specific way. When those guys got the ball on the block, because they were so hard to stop, it almost drew your entire defense in. And so not only can you those perimeter outside shots that guy can kick it out, which I think that it requires skill and it requires training and practice, which is a whole other part of this whole conversation. But when those defenders go to close out on those guys, let's say a defender is defending James Harden straight up, he's already on him, versus trying to pick up James Harden on a closeout. Which one is more difficult? Obviously, it's the closeout. So getting those inside-outside looks, beating the defense with a pass. I mean, you look at the 2014 Spurs is a really good example of this. They beat defenses with passing. A lot of those guys that you talked about, the Isaiah Thomas, the Kyrie Irving, the James Harden, they beat guys off the dribble. Easier to defend, even though those guys still go out and they score 50 points. It's much easier to defend one guy driving in after dribbling for 12 seconds than it is to try and cover literally the entire court, because the ball flies faster than any one player can move.
Yeah, I mean, you're right about that, but I don't know. Okay, you're a high school basketball coach. Let's take a step back for a second and talk about this at a very grassroots level, because you're a guy who works with kids, 14 to 18. How often are kids getting, like, for example, if you watch these mixtapes with Zion Williamson and all these up-and-coming kids, or a couple of years ago, Thon Maker was the YouTube sensation in high school, and you see guys who are 6'8", 6'9", handling the ball on the perimeter. And to me, it kind of starts at home kind of thing, where if you're going to build that player, he has to be 12 and 13 working on his footwork, and that to me just seems to be sort of a dead part of the game in youth league. Like, I haven't coached in 3 or 4 years now, but I used to coach at the middle school and JV level, and it's kind of like faded out of the game in terms of having a back-to-the-basket score, even at a very low level. How much do you think that impacts building a guy like Shaquille O'Neal in the modern NBA?
I think that's one of the biggest reasons for this change. I think that the AAU style of basketball in particular, where you don't see, because these kids are not able to spend a lot of time together practicing like set plays or an offense, they're mostly worried about skill because, again, the amount of time that they spend together. They spend most of their time playing in games. When they do have practice time in the gym, they're usually working on skill development, not necessarily like team play. And I think that the back-to-the-basket player is valuable in a team-oriented style of basketball than you would see in like the AAU style of basketball. So I 100% agree. I think that it starts at home, and honestly trying to get kids who are not already there to work on things like back-to-the-basket post moves is one of the more difficult things. We sort of talked about it at the beginning of the show. They come into the gym and they've watched Steph Curry shoot, a 30-foot shot, goes 7 for 11 last night and has a great game. You watch, they see that happen, and even if they're a player, they kind of want to do that too. That being said, like, if you again have that kid who can dominate, and I think at the high school level it's even more. Because in the NBA, you have bigger, longer, faster guys. In the high school level, if you have that guy who can go back to the basket, you can feed him on the block. I know that our offense in particular works really well when we are able to get those inside-outside passes, because the guy that we have playing center is A, a really good passer from that spot, and B, anytime he gets it, because, he's not necessarily the biggest guy out on the court, but because the ball is in the middle of that defense, regardless of whether they're playing man or zone, the entire sort of like sucks into the middle of the court, and then he can kick it out to basically anybody outside on the perimeter. I think you've touched on something else there
that's interesting to me, and that's the passing ability of the center, because you think about, like, okay, traditionally the center not a great passing guy, but there have been great passers that play the center position. Wes Unseld, Bill Walton, even guys today like Marc Gasol. But there's not an emphasis on that kind of guy growing up. Like, when you're the center, you do X, Y, and Z, and usually X, Y, and Z doesn't involve facilitating the offense. And so maybe that's another factor in that guys who grow up playing the post, that like, right off the top of my head, watching Bam Adebayo play last year at Kentucky, sometimes he even looked lost in the offensive flow, and that's one player, and I know it's that whole you're talking about one guy kind of thing, but to me it's like sort of a hallmark of the way kids grow up, that when it gets into a half court, centers and forwards, guys who are traditional back-to-the-basket players, or even guys who would have been traditional back-to-the-basket players, don't really have that place in the middle of the offense, because they have to give De'Aaron Fox and Malik Monk room to work, or whoever, but that's sort of just the stand-in of like, I remember that distinctly while you're talking, was here was a guy who looked like in years gone by could have been dominant and looked fantastic in summer league, but his position in the NBA is tenuous because that is just not a rewarded skill set right now.
Right. And I think that, again, like one of the sort of like the zone are now allowed, or the zone defenses are now allowed in the NBA. That's really, but guys who drive and get to the basket a lot. I think one thing in particular, when we talk, it's important to also realize that a guy like that, those back to the basket guys, especially, looking past the high school level, we get to the college or the NBA level. If you drive on the weak side of where they are, so a lot of teams, they'll sort of put that guy on the weak side block. When a player drives, he sucks that guy's defender off onto them, and then if they can throw, you see, James Harden's a perfect example of this. He draws that center to him, and then he throws that lob to Capella, who isn't a great floor spacing center by any stretch of the imagination. But because he has that driving ability, it creates other lanes in itself. So maybe not those lanes for them. And I think that's, again, a part of that AAU game that has sort of bled over into this is you look at those AAU players and they're basically valued entirely off of the points that they've scored. So they want to get the buckets themselves. If you look at the guys that are, again, those back to the basket guys that can't really stretch out much, well, they're always around the basket. If you have a guy who can break somebody down off the dribble and drive and draw that center, it creates a whole other set of, a whole different set of geometry for a pass and then a score, which is something that's really important for like creating a multi-level offensive attack. So it a little bit, but I think it also gives more options for somebody to kick to those players that might not exist otherwise. Because if you have a smaller guy trying to play that spot, a weak side defender who's also 6'7", guarding somebody or stepping down onto somebody who's 6'8" is a problem than a guy who's 6'7" stepping down onto somebody who's 7'1".
Yeah, I mean, that's you certainly make a good point there. I guess my follow-up question to this, because you've laid out the case so well, I feel like you've done a really good job. You really understand this. You are someone who obviously is involved in basketball at a high level. But I guess my question is, how good would a player have to be for that style of play to, because it's almost a kind of play that is non-existent. We've talked about that, but it's almost non-existent from the beginning. Like you said, like kids in middle school and JVs in high school aren't playing this way. So how good would a player have to be to come on the scene and make this a viable alternative where it was like overwhelmingly good?
I think considering the way that the league has, I think if we're talking 10 years ago, the bar is a lot lower. The way that the league has gone, I mean, you've talked about this, a lot, is how devoted the league as a whole is right now to this space and space. So getting somebody to break that mold is going to be very, very challenging. That player would have to be, the first guy at least, would have to be transcendent. And I don't want to like sugarcoat that at all. Like, you would have to be seeing like the next coming of Shaq. You would have to be seeing like a true guy who is going to, take advantage of those mismatches in a way that a lot of people aren't. And they would also probably need to be coming from a more diverse basketball background than the AAU circuit, which might be that those guys aren't being seen anymore. Is again because we're talking, and I don't have necessarily a problem with AAU style of basketball. Like, I don't want people to think that. I think it values certain skills over other ones. And I think that we would have to see some not necessarily come out of that system, get enough attention from colleges and then eventually NBA teams to really see that person take a hold in the league. And once that happens I think that you're going to see more teams looking for that kid who can come in and really do the things that I'm talking about, the passing out of the post, being able to score over either shoulder, going through a smaller defender. I mean, I want to go back to the NBA and the Rockets for a second. You look at Capella in the series against the Thunder last year. He's their starting center. He was completely overmatched by Steven Adams. He looked terrible, and it was because of size. If you imagine Steven Adams had more of an offensive game, scored 30 points a night, and it could have been a very different series just because he is so much bigger than Capella is. I think that it would take a transcendent player to get what you're talking, to sort of meet what you're talking about. But once it happens, you could see more of it.
Yeah, I think there's a cross sport comparison that sort of makes a lot of sense to this one. There's just been a big push in football talking about not being able to find offensive linemen because the play style as you go high school to college to pro changes so much that these guys have so much to learn and they have so much to adjust to and they have to change to the speed of the game. I kind of think that offensive lineman to big man, particularly center comparison, holds a lot of weight because you're learning a different thing. Like you're not learning to play basketball in that back to the basket way. And then now you're trying to learn the offense, you're trying to fit in, you're trying to figure out what your place in the team is. And then oftentimes that gets sort of swept to the side. Any thought of being a back to the basket player, because I feel like there are some guys who could be back to the basket players who are in the league right now. Like the name that immediately jumps to my mind is Greg Monroe. Greg Monroe has fantastic footwork. He's a bigger guy, and he utilizes his size. Well, obviously not as big as Shaq was, but Greg Monroe seems like an anachronism. Like he would have been a really, really great player had he come along 15 years ago, but now he's sort of just the middle of the road. And obviously Greg Monroe, not as talented as some guy like Shaquille O'Neal, but I just think it's interesting that there are guys who, had they grown up that way or if they were allowed to flourish in that way, could be the guy that you're talking about. But it almost seems to be bred out as you go high school to AAU to college to the pro game.
Well, I there's actually jumps to mind sort of when you were talking about that, a younger guy who checks all those boxes, but isn't really getting an opportunity, and that's Jahlil Okafor in Philadelphia. Watching him play in college, he was heralded as the next, real true power center. Loved watching him play in college personally. And then he got to the NBA and was sort of left behind. And I think it does sort of come to the other side of the ball a lot more than we've talked about so far, where these guys are getting more played off the court on the defensive side of things. Because I think Okafor has the ability on offense to contribute to just about every team in the league. I mean, Warriors and how much of a precedent they've put on that long range shooting, the pace and space thing. If you put him in the center of their offense, and when they need that high percentage look inside, there aren't very that can really truly stop him on the offensive side of the ball. However, we have gone to such this switch heavy style of defense. You try to put him on Steve. Westbrook goes off of that screen, and now Okafor has to try and guard Russell Westbrook. It's kind of a joke. Obviously, there would need to be a lot of adjustments made by any coach to make that work. So I think that the defensive side of the ball is where this whole power center argument does kind of fall. As far as offense goes, though, I think that he's a guy that has all those tools that you're talking about with Greg Monroe, and honestly could probably be seeing a much bigger role somewhere else, but might not be able to keep up on defense.
Yeah, that is interesting. It reminded me of a couple last week as the Eurobasket was going on. Slovenia played against Spain, and Slovenia just kept slamming Paul Gasol into pick and rolls because he's so flat-footed. And obviously Gasol's older, but you start to see that problem that you're talking about where you have this bigger, hulking, sort of flat-footed center get caught in these pick and rolls and sort of get exposed. And that's what Dragic, who was amazing through the Eurobasket, just found all the little niches with Gasol, and that's how Slovenia beat Spain. So I think it's an interesting point to bring up that the defensive side of the ball is such a problem for that guy because it's very hard to find someone who's going to check all of the boxes, and not impossible by any stretch of the imagination, because these guys come along, these once in a lifetime guys come along all the time. But it's very hard to find somebody who can switch on defense, has a passing eye, has good footwork, who has worked on their interior scoring. Like it starts to be almost insurmountable when it comes to the skill set that this theoretical guy would need to have.
Well, yeah, but think about the number of boxes that a guy like Russell Westbrook, James Harden, LeBron James, Kevin Durant. Think about the number of boxes that those guys all check as far as like skill sets go. You're just looking. All we're talking about is looking at a different position on the court. Again, I am saying that we need to find if this is going to happen, where the one team in the league guy that sort of zigs to everyone else's zag. This guy would need to be transcendent. So I am talking about the fact that like he would need to check a lot of boxes. I don't necessarily think that's one of the things that they need to be able to do. It's a very popular thing in the NBA right now. But you can sort of defense on the pick and roll differently to try and make that work. And you can do it in a way that still does work. I think for a guy like Steph Curry who can shoot the way he can, that might be sort of the issue. Looking at guys like Russell Westbrook and James Harden, both of those guys are sub 40% 3-point shooters. You could definitely have, I would trust somebody to go underneath that screen and sort of force them to shoot a deeper three in that situation, and then let that center stay on the situation. Obviously, like, comes down to the end of the game. I don't know how that would work, because with a guy like hits so many clutch shots, he might be able to hit it anyway. And maybe you have to take him off for that last defensive possession or something. But I do think that there are ways to cover up that side of like that, or the proverbial checkbox that I'm talking about.
Yeah, I tend to agree, but I mean, it's like I said, like I didn't bring you on to pick apart your argument and tell you it was dumb. What I really wanted to understand what you were talking about, and so I feel like now that I'm sort of understanding, what you're talking about is not quite so evolutionary as it initially sounded. Like, it sounded like a big change. What you're saying is, go back to it. But when you start to think about how a player like that would fit into the system, that player is probably not as far off as it. I mean, obviously would still require that transcendent skill set to make teams sit up and take notice of this player, but he's not so far off from what an NBA game is now. It's just a different way to attack teams where weaknesses are, because there are so few teams that good teams don't have weaknesses on the perimeter anymore, because that's what the game's become. It's become positionless basketball with a bunch of forwards. But if you get a guy who can attack a team at its weak spot, the center position, it doesn't seem as tremendously off base as what I initially thought it was.
Well, and I think that the other part of this too is that you could see a team put together a roster of more specialized players. Like you look at Boston, for example, really good example of this. They put together a whole bunch of forwards. I would say that Hayward is probably their most elite 3-point shooter, and he's not even really, again, elite. If you were taking the Dwight Howard 09 Orlando Magic example, if you were like one of these teams, this guy lands in their lap. They can go out and get a lot of guys on the market that are being undervalued, because 3-point shooting is very valuable in the NBA right now. They are looking for skill sets that sort of go along with that. They want a guy who can also drive to the basket, who is also incredibly athletic. On this team around like this quote unquote power center, you would need much more like a much greater ability to spot up and shoot, catch and shoot. You would need pass the ball inside, who can flick the ball around the perimeter. And I think it would also sort of open up the bidding war for a true pass first point guard again. I mean, we might be seeing that with Lonzo. I haven't seen him play an NBA game yet. I don't know where he's going to be at. But a real pass-first point guard in the league that's been really considered elite. And I can't really maybe Rajon Rondo with the Celtics was the last one.
I don't know. Kidd and Nash are the ones that come to mind, but that's been 10 years ago since. Well, it's probably been 8 years since Nash was elite, and probably a little bit longer for Kidd. But those are the last two guys that were really, really past first point guards that played at such an elite level.
Yeah, and I think. I mean, one of the guys, again, I do like to sort of find these guys that are sort of under the radar a little bit. A few years ago, watching Iona play in March Madness, they had a point guard, Scott Machado, who is, I believe he's still prime in assists in NCAA history. He floated around the NBA. I think he played probably 20 games at the NBA level league, and he's now playing overseas. He had probably the best passing vision of anybody I've seen. Again, Lonzo is sort of a little bit different from this because I think he also sort of possesses that. But as far as the guy that doesn't necessarily score, but who can pass to such a high level that they create opportunity, I think that, again, on this team that we're talking about with that quote-unquote power center, you would see a role for this out because you would need somebody who can get the ball down inside to him under pressure. You would need somebody who can also work the perimeter and find those shooters that you would need to put around that guy in the low block.
I just looked up Scott Machado, not a name I was familiar with, but his last year at Iona, his per 40, he was averaging 11.2 assists per game. That's pretty insane for a college player.
Yeah, he if you have a second after the show, I would definitely recommend looking up some of his highlights because there aren't very many of them out there. He has a couple videos on YouTube, but just absolutely incredible. Like his passes are like on a rope. It's absolutely insane the kind of things that he sees develop. And that he was sort of pushed out of the league because he doesn't have a. I think he was like a 34% 3-point shooter, unless my memory is failing me. He's not a very consistent scorer, and because of the value that we place on all five guys having to be able to score, being able to shoot from long range, being able to do all these things, he was again sort of pushed out of the league. And I think that he was a guy who does have a one specific ability that would let him play with guys in the NBA, and he just needed to find the right situation for that. And I think that again on a team with really good spot up shooters. And a guy down low who he would be able to get the ball to. I think that you could see somebody like that have success.
I mean, you've got me convinced. I would be interested to see it. All right, I got one more question for you, and then I'll let you go. My question is there a guy like that in the league right now? A guy that you could see developing into a player, like a Joel Embiid or somebody who could develop into an interior guy who warps defenses in that way that you're talking about?
I mean, so I think that those guys sort of are there. They had you've hit on it right on the nail. Is that the time isn't really being put in to develop those skill sets. And I see all the time on Twitter. You see Joel Embiid goes into practice or whatever he puts on. Same thing with Karl Anthony Towns. You see how many long range shots he's taken. I think that. Actually, Karl Anthony Towns probably suited to make that jump. I mean, even DeMarcus Cousins, actually, sort of a current quote-unquote superstar. But he's a guy who didn't really touch the ball on the low block a lot. I looked it up before the show. About 21% of his touches were on the low block, or 21% of the total offensive touches were on the low block, which for a guy of that skill set, it's honestly a lot lower than I would have expected because check a lot of those boxes. He can play defense at multiple positions. Obviously, you wouldn't want to put him out on Curry, but he can guard probably 3s, 4s, and 5s for a short stretch, at least for those first two. He can go over either shoulder and score. He actually has sort of a nice jump shot, but he takes so many long-range shots now because, again, that's sort of where the NBA is pushing these guys to play. I think that with summer or a couple off seasons where these guys actually work on this skill set, yeah, you could see that happen. I don't know if necessarily that guy's in the league right now, just because we haven't had an opportunity to see it. But I do think that there probably is somebody out there, and I don't know if, like you said, I don't know if it's necessarily that far away. It just takes finding. Sort of my big push is go out and find those power centers, because right now the NBA is going so small that there's a pretty big hole that can be taken advantage of by the right team and the right player.
Well, I love your commitment to strategy, to grand strategy and tactics, because it seems too often that we have sort of said, well, the Warriors are going to win and that's how it's going to be. So that commitment to let's find the next iteration of strategy is pretty refreshing to me, because it's good to know that, you know, that teams and players and the league is still looking forward. And I feel like, you know, that's sort of what you're embodying is let's find the next guy, and maybe we will see a power center. I mean, the way the college games develop in sort of in a different way, that guy would absolutely dominate when guys like Kennedy Meeks play as well as they do. And Kennedy Meeks is by no stretch of the imagination the power center that a guy like Shaquille O'Neal was. So there certainly is a place for it. And it will be interesting over the next couple of seasons to see if anybody can, A, find that guy, and then B, integrate him into his system.
Yeah, and I mean, it has to be a transcendent guy that we talked about. I really hope that it happens, because I think it would be really the entire league sort of freak out when they realize, oh man, like we are behind the 8 ball here. But, you know, hopefully it does happen, because as much as I love watching the pace and space 3-point game, more than that, I like seeing teams do something different.
Yeah,
I think that's a really fascinating part of basketball, especially when you talk about a league like the NBA where it's sort of self-contained.
Well, Seldon, I appreciate you coming on the show, man, and appreciate you enlightening us on the power center and the changes in the game. Do you have anything coming up for the 94 Feet Report you want to get a plug in for?
Yeah, I'm working on an article right now about Tracy McGrady going into the Hall of Fame. He was sort of the guy that really made me fall in love with the team and basketball in general, and just an absolutely amazing player, sort of undervalued because of his injury history. And so, yeah, that should be coming down the actually. So keep an eye out for that.
All right, man.
Appreciate you having me on, too.
Yeah, man, I appreciate it. And we'll definitely have you back in the regular season, because I feel so often like I talk about players and you know, storylines that it's fun to sort of take that step back and talk about X's and O's and strategy and tactics. So I will definitely have you back on, even if it's just for me, even if nobody else listens.
I look forward to it.
All right, man. I'll talk to you later.
Have a good one.
You too. Special thanks to Seldon Levasseur for coming on the show today. You can check out all his work on 94 Feet Report. Make sure you're checking out the website every day. We're entering closer towards the beginning of the NBA regular season, and we want to be your home for all your NBA needs. So check that out. Check out the website, 94feetreport.com. Check us out on Twitter at the 94 Feet Report. Make sure to follow the show, subscribe. I said all that stuff in the beginning, but I still mean it. It's very nice to have people listening and following along with the show, so make sure you're doing that. And hit me up on Twitter if you have anything that you want to hear about before we get started with the season, because I'll be more than happy to do a show for whatever you want to hear about. So anyway, until next time, I'm your host, Alex West. Have a good night.